Hello and welcome to another module in our soot-free and zero-emission urban bus fleets technology transition curriculum. Today's presentation will be about financing the soot-free and zero-emission buses. Here are some key terms in today's module. Leasing model is an innovation in business models for bus operators. Instead of buying and owning physical assets themselves, operators can lease buses and infrastructure from a third-party investor. Leasing models can be further divided into capital leases, operating leases, and component leases. Social cost of carbon is an economic estimate of the damage that would arise from emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide, in our case from internal combustion engine buses. Similarly, the negative impact of black carbon emission from pre-Euro 6 vehicles can also be measured in dollar terms, which is the social cost of black carbon. Factoring in social costs can change the total cost of ownership of different bus technologies. The learning objectives from today's module include: apply the total cost of ownership framework and its components to analyze the cost of bus technology transitions, understand the big picture factors that influence the TCO of bus technologies in cities, understand the taxonomy of common bus ownership and operating models. Be aware of finance and business options under each ownership and business model that can support soot-free and zero-emission technology transition. Understand the available financing mechanisms and sources for each kind of ownership and operation model. Let's recall that in the soot-free and zero-emission technology options module and the fleet-wide planning module, we mentioned the concept of total cost of ownership, which is a framework to think about the cost of different bus technologies and how they compare. TCO, also known as life cycle cost, is the sum of the costs to acquire, operate, and maintain the vehicle and its associated fueling infrastructure over a specified ownership period. Soot-free, and in particular zero-emission buses, are at a disadvantage when it comes to purchase price, the upfront amount that operators need to pay. But the situation changes when we use total cost of ownership framework. Here's a more detailed breakdown of total cost of ownership used for the financing analysis of buses, from the bus and infrastructure purchase costs, which are upfront, to the recurring operations and maintenance costs. This table distinguishes down payments and loan payments for the big ticket expenses like bus and infrastructure purchases, which can be a helpful way to think about financing options for these expensive newer technologies. Upfront down payments for vehicle and infrastructure and costs of financing are easier to ascertain as they are agreed at the beginning of a technology transition, whereas it is more difficult to plan ahead for fuel, electricity, and maintenance costs. Another angle to look at TCO, especially for zero-emission buses, is from the bus's utilization and battery sizes on board battery electric buses. This figure here, developed by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, shows total cost of ownership modeling comparisons between a few different battery electric bus scenarios, both the battery size and charging option represented by different colored curves, and the annual bus utilization is on the x-axis. Diesel buses, oftentimes used by cities, are used here as a baseline. Their modeling study concludes that different charging strategies and battery sizes can reach cost parity with diesel buses at different levels of utilization. The trend worth noting here is that there is a powerful and inverse relationship between TCO and the annual distance driven that favors the lower operations and maintenance costs of electric buses when the savings can be spread over longer distances. To spread out the higher purchase price and financing costs of BEVs and their support infrastructure, it is necessary to use this equipment to work on longer routes with higher annual mileage. Note that some of the studies you've seen in the past few slides were conducted a few years ago, and that the assumptions behind the calculations, such as the cost of batteries and fuels, have changed. And many of them are done at the aggregate level as opposed to route level TCO that will be unique to each operator. But the findings and observations will still hold. The World Bank analyzed total cost of ownership of different bus technologies in 5 Latin American cities and found wide discrepancies in terms of TCO within and between cities. The analysis reviews factors that can affect TCO comparison between different technologies. In Buenos Aires, for example, the cost to operate a BEB in a depot charging arrangement is more than $2 per kilometer, or more than 50 cents more expensive than the Euro 5 diesel bus baseline. It is the most expensive city in the analysis for battery electric buses. On the other hand, Santiago is the least expensive for battery electric buses, with the total cost of ownership for operating a depot-charged BEB less than $1.50 per kilometer, even lower than that of a Euro 6 diesel bus. What accounts for the difference in cost between Santiago and Buenos Aires is that Buenos Aires subsidizes diesel fuel to artificially lower the refueling cost of diesel buses. Battery electric buses therefore have a higher price in Buenos Aires than in Santiago. The interest rates for bus financing are also higher in Argentina than they are in Chile. The TCO framework is used more widely for zero-emission battery electric buses to justify the higher upfront costs. We can also use the same framework to compare the costs between soot-free internal combustion engine buses versus buses using older emission standards, and between diesel and CNG. The figure on the extreme right is the same analysis for Mexico City, where soot-free CNG buses and two standards of diesel, Euro 5 and Euro 6, are compared together with hybrid buses and battery electric buses. In this case, upgrading to Euro 6 from baseline Euro 5 diesel buses increases the total cost of ownership, while CNG buses have a lower TCO. In Mexico City, the most cost-effective bus technology is still battery electric with fast charging. One thing worth mentioning for infrastructure investments is that in most cities, diesel supply and distribution infrastructure are already in place, and in some cases, so is CNG. That puts the refueling infrastructure purchase for diesel and CNG buses at an advantage. The previous slides about cost have not discussed emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollutants like NOx and black carbon from older diesel buses, and how transitioning to soot-free and zero-emission buses technologies can reduce those costs and change the total cost of ownership. An ICCT study estimated the monetized climate and health damages of black carbon and CO2 and how they would change the total cost of ownership for bus fleets in 20 cities worldwide. Panel A on the left gives the total cost of ownership in the form of direct financial outlays, including costs of bus and infrastructure acquisition, operation, and maintenance. Panel B on the right gives the total cost of ownership, but combines estimates in panel A with the monetized social value of climate and health benefits from life cycle CO2 and tailpipe black carbon emission reductions from soot-free buses. Panel B clearly shows cost savings relative to Panel A because of the inclusion of social costs of CO2 and black carbon, even in scenarios where diesel prices are low and battery electric buses are expensive. Here's another example. In this figure, the green bars represent the direct, which is the purchase, maintenance, fueling, and operating total cost of ownership for 4 types of bus technologies in Sao Paulo, Brazil, while the gray and blue bars are social costs of greenhouse gases and black carbon. Diesel hybrid and depot charging battery electric buses have further lowered their total cost of ownership relative to the baseline P7 diesel buses as well as Euro 6 biodiesel by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and eliminating black carbon emissions. Since many cities have soot-free and zero-emission bus mandates precisely to protect human health and the climate, these social cost savings of soot-free and zero-emission buses should not be overlooked. This isn't even taking into consideration the pollutants like particulate matter and NOx. To help us think about financing options for soot-free and zero-emission buses, it is helpful to picture a taxonomy of the ownership and business models. We can roughly categorize transit bus systems along 3 axes. If fleet ownership is private or public, if fleet operations are separate from fleet ownership, and the degree of integration in the public transit system, namely how many operators there are in each system. From these, there are a few archetypes of urban bus transit business models. The first type of business and ownership model is public provision. The infrastructure is publicly owned and bus service is provided by a public entity. This is the major public transit model in the United States and China. The transit agency procures, owns, and operates buses and bears all the costs. These costs are often subsidized by different levels of government. In practice, bus ownership and operations under public control may be mixed. For example, Shenzhen has 3 bus operating companies that are technically under mixed ownership, but are considered to be state-owned because the city is the largest shareholder, and the companies receive financial support from the public budget. The second type of business model is private ownership of physical assets, including the buses, refueling, and recharging infrastructure. The city and transit agency play a supervisory role for the entire system and contracts private entities to service specific areas. Private operators purchase, own, and operate and maintain the vehicles. This model is common in Europe, Latin America, and Oceania. A third archetype is the separation of ownership of assets and bus operations. A private party owns the bus fleet as physical assets, and a different set of companies operates and maintains the buses. Oftentimes, the party that owns the assets are manufacturers or utility companies, those who are more willing and able to take risks related to new technologies. Third-party owners of assets then lease buses, batteries, and charging facilities to operators. This is a relatively newer kind of business model that has emerged to cope with high upfront costs of zero-emission bus products. More on the leasing model on the subsequent slide. The last column in the table refers to the last archetype of transit systems commonly found in developing cities, which are fragmented, small private operators that each have a relatively small-sized fleet and sometimes provide unstructured, informal services. Each type of transit bus operating model with its own asset ownership and operation structure needs sources of financing. Bus acquisition options for public and private operators include cash or loan purchases, as well as several kinds of leasing agreement, capital leases, operator leases, and battery leases. The choice of finance option will shift the credit, operational, and technology risk to the lender, operator, or manufacturer, and each financing mechanism is suited to facilitate a certain business model more. We'll discuss each of the 3 financing methods in the subsequent slides. First, cash purchase by the operator. In the United States and many cities in Europe where the public transit system is publicly owned, financed, and operated, bus purchases are paid for upfront from the existing public budgets and operation revenues, which may come from bus fares, advertising revenues, property leasing, etc. These public transportation budgets from the operator and municipality cover capital and operational costs of the transit system. The bus is legally owned by the operator and listed on that operator's balance sheet as an asset. Since the operators are making the purchase, the financial risks are borne by the operators and the municipality who finance them. Other levels of government may provide incentives like grants to operators to afford more expensive technologies. In other parts of the world, public investment incentives are even covering costs of private operators as they transition to soot-free and zero-emission technologies. We'll discuss government financial incentives and support policies in greater length in a separate module in the curriculum. Because the upfront costs of soot-free and zero-emission bus technologies are substantially higher, public and private operators may not have the financial power to purchase buses in cash. This is where loan purchases come in. Here's a summary of financial institutions used as sources of loans for bus financing, ranging from multilateral development banks, dedicated climate finance groups, to traditional investors like export-import banks and regular commercial banks. They offer different products and packages, from concessional loans and grants to guarantees and insurance, depending on each one's investment model and risk assessment. Some development banks and climate finance initiatives help operators, while export-import banks provide funding assistance to manufacturers. Financial institutions start to provide products for loan purchases with sustainability objectives, and soot-free and zero-emission urban bus investments can take advantage of green bonds and concessional loans. Green bonds are similar in financial features as other types of bonds, but their proceeds must finance projects with positive environmental and climate change impact. In the transportation sector, they have longer tenures and can support the asset liability management requirements of institutional investments. Like other types of bonds, green bonds are backed by the issuer's entire balance sheet. One example where green bonds have been used to finance soot-free and zero-emission buses is in China, where the Tianjin Public Transportation Group purchased more than 500 electric buses using a loan at a preferential rate. The source of finance was a capital pool that the Shanghai Pudong Development Bank created from the issuance of green bonds. In other cases, bus operators can release bonds to raise capital for soot-free and zero-emission investments. Nobina, a Nordic transit operator, issued a green bond for 500 million Swedish crowns in 2019 to finance 140 zero-emission buses across its network. Concessional loans are provided by a financier with flexible lending conditions, such as lower interest rates and/or longer repayment schedules. In Bogotá, bus service operators financed several hundreds of hybrid electric buses with concessional loans, made possible through on-lending by Colombia's Entrepreneurial Development and Export-Import Bank to local financial intermediaries. The bank used $40 million that came from the Clean Technology Fund and the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as financing from BNDES and the Swedish Export Credit Agency. The Green Climate Fund and Global Environment Facility also provided concessional loans. Apart from direct financing sources, there is also a growing number of enabling facilities that can help cities and national governments transition to soot-free and zero-emission buses. The C40 Cities Finance Facility, CFF, for example, aims to provide up to $1 million in technical assistance and capacity development to its member cities for projects that can include the procurement of zero-emission buses. In countries like the US, national and state-level grant funding for bus technology transitions is often not enough to pay the full cost of the more expensive battery electric buses. For private operators in urban transit business models that do not have the municipality's financial backing, the full cost of soot-free and zero-emission bus technologies may be even more prohibitive. Leasing can be a way to manage the large discrepancy in upfront costs and spread the payments over a time in a way that better matches the operations and maintenance savings of zero-emission and soot-free buses. An operating lease is a contract that allows for the use of a vehicle but does not transfer the ownership. Operators pay the bus owners, who in many cases are also the bus manufacturer themselves, through operational income. This offsets against taxable profits. Rental payments often do not cover the full cost of the asset. Therefore, it is quite often the case that operating leases contain additional components, like vehicle maintenance contracts. An operating lease keeps all of the risks and advantages of ownership on the side of the leasing company and poses no residual value risk, while also ensuring a predictable cash flow due to its fixed monthly cost. Short-term leases can also serve as testing periods and pilots, where the bus operator and the bus supplier sign a short-term lease to test and evaluate a specific vehicle technology under the conditions specific to a city. The second leasing model is called capital lease. Like an operating lease, the lease payments are paid for the vehicle and/or fixed infrastructure for a specified term, and the operator may purchase the vehicles at a specified residual value at the end of the lease. Unlike operating leases, capital leases require the lessee to have a strong balance sheet, and the lease duration is typically longer than an operating lease, many times until the end of the useful life of an asset. This module was adopted by an operator in Warsaw, Poland, with manufacturer Solaris. In some alternative capital leases, after the leasing agreement ends, the city or the bus operator does not become the owner of an asset, and instead the bus is transferred to another city or a different country. The third option is component leases, where the asset owner leases batteries separately from the buses because batteries are a major cost component in battery electric buses. The battery lease is possible both for leased and owned buses. With costs of batteries spread out, purchase prices of battery electric buses are now more on par with diesel buses. The US manufacturer Proterra is currently experimenting with a component leasing business model. Proterra sells battery electric buses at the price of a diesel bus upfront and recuperates the discount by converting the capital cost of the batteries into an operating cost for the operator. Proterra sells BEVs at the price of a diesel bus upfront and recuperates the discount by converting the capital cost of the batteries into an operating cost for the operator, which is converted by the operating savings of battery electric buses. One of the business models shown earlier refers to the separation of bus fleet ownership and operations. This is an emerging arrangement that has the potential to reduce risks and encourage faster adoption of zero-emission vehicles. In these arrangements, a fleet company, sometimes the vehicle manufacturers, or a third party like utility providers, owns and maintains the assets, while retaining the risks related to vehicle performance. At the same time, the buses are operated by concessionaires that provide drivers and manage day-to-day operations. This model is borrowed from the airline and railway sectors, where rolling stock operating companies own and maintain physical assets while the operations are contracted to other companies. Separate ownership and operations are often combined with the leasing model, where asset owners can lease buses, batteries, and charging facilities to private and public operators. This figure here shows the asset ownership model that has facilitated the rapid deployment of hundreds of zero-emission buses in Santiago, Chile. NLX and ENGIE, two electricity companies, purchase and own the vehicles and lease them to operators through a fleet provision contract. They recoup their investments as the AFT Trust pays fleet provision payments, backed by the public transit authorities in the city. The back end of the business model involves three sources of investments providing funding in the form of equity and loans or credits, like we described in earlier slides. Even with innovative ownership and business models in place, government funding is sometimes needed as a catalyst to kickstart the investment in soot-free and zero-emission bus technologies, especially for publicly owned transit agencies. In the United States, transit operators can apply for the U.S. Federal Transit Administration's Low or No Emission Vehicles program, which awarded $130 million in 2020 for the purchase or lease of low or zero-emission vehicles as well as related equipment or facilities nationwide. In California, operators can tap into a wider range of state-level funding. One of them is the California Air Resources Board's Hybrid and Zero-Emission Truck and Bus Voucher Incentive Project, which falls under the funding plan for clean transportation incentives, with a total funding pool of $25 million for 2020 to 2021 from California's Air Quality Improvement Program. California Climate Investments, revenue from the state's greenhouse gas cap and trade program, is also used to fund zero-emission bus technologies for operators. Private operators tend to have limited cash flow and low profit margins, which is a barrier to securing operating leases. In such cases, public transit agencies may reduce the credit risk to the lessor by offering lease guarantees or takeover clauses. Such provisions allow the public agency to take over the lease payments and operate or outsource the operation of the bus in the case of operator insolvency. In Mexico City, for example, the city takes on demand risk by paying operators per kilometer as stipulated in concession agreements. In addition, credit payments are executed via escrow from the transit authority, providing a guarantee to investors. We have covered a number of financing options that are available to support soot-free and zero-emission urban bus technology transition. While not all of them will be available in all countries and cities, it should give you a good idea of what some of the common arrangements and models are. Here are some of the high-level takeaway messages from this module. While soot-free and zero-emission bus technologies have higher upfront purchase costs, they are at a cost advantage from a total cost of ownership point of view. Soot-free and zero-emission bus technologies have even lower total cost of ownership, with societal costs of pollution and climate change factored in. To accelerate the adoption of zero-emission technologies, innovative ownership and business models such as debt financing, separation of asset ownership, and leasing models are being tested. Depending on the structure of public transit systems, different financing options are available and additional support mechanisms from the government may be possible. Here are the studies referenced in the module and some other resources about financing soot-free and zero-emission urban bus technology transitions. If you have any questions, please reach out to me at y.xie@theicct.org. Thank you. Research and development of this curriculum is supported by Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety International Climate Initiative, and Partnering for Green Growth and the Global Goals 2030.